In the past couple of episodes, we've been looking at how we are in a created reality within a larger reality. We live within space-time, but then outside of space-time, we have this whole other realm that actually could have many names. We could call it base reality, eternity, heaven. Jesus called it the kingdom. And what's interesting is that science is now discovering that we are actually hardwired to know about that other place, almost from the very beginning of our lives. Almost from the moment we are born, we are programmed to instinctively know about that other place. Now, of course, the Bible says God has planted eternity in the human heart. So it comes as no surprise to Christians that we should have this instinctive knowledge of eternity within our hearts. But what is interesting is that science is now backing the Bible up on this. We are indeed hardwired to believe in eternity. In a 2014 study for Boston University, a research team led by Natalie Emmons interviewed 283 children across different cultures to discover what they instinctively believed about life outside of this universe. At the end of the study, they came to a clear conclusion that children are indeed hardwired to believe they are immortal. Indeed, Emmons said, belief we are somehow eternal is a universal cognitive default. Most people, regardless of race, religion, or culture, believe they are immortal. That is, people believe that part of themselves, some indelible core, soul, or essence, will transcend the body's death and live forever. In other words, we all come into this life believing we're immortal, with a large proportion of us never truly shaking the belief off. Now, what was groundbreaking about Emmons' research was that up until that moment, scientists had always assumed that children, and indeed people in general, developed their ideas about the afterlife through cultural exposure, like television or movies, or through religious instruction. But by interviewing kids who didn't have any of those influences, and that included kids in a remote Amazon village in Ecuador, Emmons discovered that these ideas of immortality actually emerge from our intuition. From our very earliest years, we instinctively believe in eternity. Now, this research by Emmons was a continuation of a previous study from 2011. In 2011, an Oxford scientist called Justin Barrett set out to answer the question, do children believe in God and heaven simply because they're told by adults? In other words, is belief in eternity taught by grown-ups, or is it simply innate? Now, the study lasted 3 years. It was extremely comprehensive, cost £1.9 million, involved 59 researchers, 40 separate studies in 20 different countries. They drew in research from anthropology, psychology, philosophy, theology. They looked at countries with both a religious and atheistic tradition. And again, they concluded the same thing, that humans are predisposed to believe in a God and an afterlife. They said people instinctively believe that some part of their mind, soul, or spirit lives on after death. The studies demonstrate that people are natural dualists, finding it easy to conceive of the separation of the mind and the body. Now, we can go back even further still, because that study built on an even earlier one from Yale University. In 2007, Paul Bloom produced a paper called Developmental Science, which was focused on how children naturally interpret the world around them. Now, Bloom reported from that study that children are, quote, intuitive theists. They intuitively believe in God and an afterlife. He said one of the most interesting discoveries in the developmental psychology of religion is that this bias towards creationism appears to be cognitively natural. Dr. Olivera Petrovich, a neuroscientist from Oxford, agrees. In her study, she interviewed a selection of preschool children from Britain and Japan. She showed them a range of man-made and natural objects and asked the kids where these items came from. Overwhelmingly, they instinctively said that God made the natural objects. Olivera said, the pattern of responding among Japanese children is highly significant in this context, seeing that those children live in a culture that does not in any way encourage a belief in God as creator. Yet the most common reply given by Japanese preschoolers about natural objects' origin was, Kami-sama, God made it. Whilst there is growing research evidence that children from across different religious and cultural backgrounds consistently attribute to God the existence of natural objects, what is so interesting about the Japanese participants is that this particular causal inference is not a product of their education, but a natural development in their understanding of the world. So again, children don't believe in God and heaven because anyone tells them to. Even without TV, movies, regardless of religious upbringing, it's just instinctive. Indeed, across all cultures, cultures, in all backgrounds, kids innately believe in a creator and instinctively believe they're going to live forever. Now, what's also interesting is that children even instinctively know about many of God's characteristics too, before anyone tells them. Sometimes atheists will say, well, of course children believe in God because in their limited experience of life, they have parents who seem to be a bit like God in their eyes, and that they appear to know everything and seem to be able to do and create anything. So for kids, it's easy to infer that God must be a bit like parents, except just higher up somehow. They have that reference point. But research tells us that's not where children's ideas of God come from. Indeed, a 2005 paper on the subject concluded, even young children differentiate God from humans and resist incorporating certain aspects of the human concept into their concept of God. So if you tell even very young children that God is essentially just a bit like their mummy and daddy except higher up, they actually resist that idea. They don't believe it. They know instinctively that God is something different from humans. The paper says, various studies suggest that children can represent certain aspects of God's characteristics, like immortality, creative power, and omniscience, quite easily and quite differently from their human representations. It continues, children may be cognitively prepared to differentially understand both humans and God. In other words, their brain seems to be already configured from birth to accept the idea of God, to receive the idea of God, and to know that He's different. Indeed, children may be cognitively equipped from early on to develop concepts of God independently from their concepts of people. The paper says that children acquire concepts of God relatively easily, and this part I find especially intriguing. The paper says, children's original assumptions about God are essentially about non-human traits, immortality, creative power, omniscience. It is the fallibility of humans that must be learned and incorporated into the concept, not the infallibility of gods. So if we pull all of this research together, we find that children instinctively have a concept of eternity, and they instinctively know about God too. Now, in 2004, Deborah Kellermans from Boston University began recognizing this through her studies, that children are indeed intuitive theists. And being an atheist herself, she didn't like that one bit. She saw this intuitive theism as something to be knocked out of kids as quickly as possible. She said educators need to suppress the belief in a godlike designer by trying to get young children to understand the mechanism of natural selection before intentional design became too entrenched. She said, what the review of recent cognitive developmental research reveals is that, by around 5 years of age, children understand natural objects as non-humanly caused, can reason about non-natural agents' mental states, and demonstrate capacity to view objects in terms of design. Finally, evidence from 6 to 10-year-olds suggests that children's assignments of purpose to nature relate to their ideas concerning intentional, non-human causation. So basically, because children instinctively believe the world was created by God, they instinctively start believing that there's also a meaning and a purpose behind it all. And Kellerman didn't like that one bit. Therefore, she emphasizes the need to suppress the God intuition in kids and to subsequently take away their sense that life has any meaning or purpose to it at all. All this is very interesting because atheists, of course, will say that children are born atheists and they are indoctrinated or brainwashed into believing in God in heaven. You often hear that. But here we can see that the opposite is actually true. Children already instinctively believe in God in eternity, and they have a brain that is hardwired to receive teaching about Him. And it's if they're to become atheists, that's when they need to be indoctrinated or brainwashed. That's when they need to have their intuitive theism suppressed or knocked out of them. Indeed, Pascal Boyer of Washington University says that the human mind seems to be uniquely composed for belief in God. Boyer says there is not one part of the brain solely responsible for religious belief, but rather the particular overlap of several cognitive systems renders religious belief desirable and easily accepted by the human mind. This means that when we opt for atheism, we are doing hard work to battle against what our minds are generally inclined and well equipped to do: believe. Our natural hardwiring is to believe in God, and if you choose atheism, you have to battle against what you instinctively know to be true. Your very brain is equipped and set up to connect you with God, and if you choose atheism, you have to indoctrinate yourself into it. You have to suppress the truth in your own mind. Now, of course, the Bible actually talks about that. In Romans it says, wicked people suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshipping the glorious ever-living God, they worshipped idols that looked like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So in conclusion, we have this instinctive knowledge that God is behind all of this. But many of us willingly try to suppress that truth. We try to indoctrinate ourselves against that truth. We try to knock intuitive theism out of our kids too. And as a result, our minds become dark and confused. What's interesting though is that on the back of all of this research, scientists are beginning to think that suppressing the idea of God might actually be ultimately futile. Roger Trigg from the 2014 study said, attempts to suppress religion are likely to be short-lived, as human thought seems to be rooted in religious concepts, such as the existence of supernatural agents or gods and the possibility of an afterlife. So as much as this generation tries to suppress the idea of God and eternity, it is so hardwired into us that it's almost impossible to do. Indeed, that's why within those who do try to suppress it, it normally just spills out in some other way. People begin to worship sports stars or teams, pop stars, actors, or make a religion out of politics or social movements. We naturally begin to create idols to try to fill the void where we instinctively know God should be, which is what Paul was talking about in this passage to the Romans. Without God, we simply turn to idols. I'm going to leave you with a question though, and it's the same question as the last video. If you are trying to suppress your intuitive theism, the question you have to ask yourself is, why are you trying to run away from God?